and I apologize if I'm a little more scattered than usual. And I read a little more than I normally do, but I'm afraid that if I don't, I really would be all over the place, so forgive me for reading a bit more. I'm going to argue that there's been a tendency amongst those who educate and research marginalized youth to view social groups or identities as fixed units of analysis. While speaking of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender youth, or queer as a monolithic group may offer the most clearly rendered representations, I'm arguing that it's deeply problematic. As Sedman argues, and I quote, "Identity is a site of ongoing social regulation and contestation rather than a quasi-natural substance or an accomplished social fact." While queer youth may or may not identify with whichever constructions that are often fixed upon them, they often cross and embody many other intersecting constructions involving identity and the self, some of which we would call identity constructions and others we would not. Many researchers note that groups are differentiated internally, yet there has been difficulty in utilizing such differentiations within research design and implementation. So today my goals are to speak both theoretically and methodologically about researching with, for, and by queer youth in ways that trouble identities as we represent them. I do this within the questioning of frames of normativity and exploring the promise of queering qualitative methodologies in educational research. And I want to talk for a minute about how I'm using queer and queering. We're finding that often queer and queering is being used as an umbrella term. Gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, two-spirited, intersex with questioning, or queer, depending upon who you talk to. I'm calling for an analysis that extends beyond the binaries of gay and straight, queer and not queer. As Talbert notes, she says, "I use the word queer to gesture towards less predictable identities and practices than lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender that they commonly signify," end quote. I hope to uncover a number of ways in which the epistemological underpinnings of certain methodologies impact research with queer youth. Queer not only denotes a rejection of the fixed identity constructions of gay, straight, bisexual, transgender, it also calls into question the normativization of heterosexual. Queer, then, is defined by its very deviation from norms of sex and gender, and is always in flux. The focus of this use of queer and queer theories is to interrogate the ways that heteronormativity maintains the status quo and unequal power relations in relation to the identities of queer youth, as well as the methodologies and epistemologies we employ in research with those youth. I'm asking what it might mean if researchers turn a queered gaze and at the very least acknowledge the impossibility of defining the intersectionalities of queerly identified youth's lives and identities as the basis upon which to undertake analyses. That is, I'm arguing that by utilizing and accepting the multiplicity of lives and perceptions within a, quote, single, unquote, queer youth embodiment necessitates a movement away from an overwhelming surety and observations and interpretations about the subject as knowable. In these messy conversations, I'm working on and against and with an acknowledgement that truth is partial and murky. This is better than last night in class. You can ask Rocco, I was squealing. At least I dropped an octave today. In order to delve into issues of ethical research with or about queer youth, it's necessary to review a few areas of concern and some of the possibilities of working with youth more generally. The words, opinions, and sense makings of marginalized youth remain, I would argue, underrepresented in educational research, particularly research that I do, which is social science research. Yet when the relatively few studies that highlight or focus on students' perceptions are examined, the insights and analyses presented demonstrate the power and importance of listening to youth. I wonder what it would mean for research with adolescents if studies were designed that started with the premise of students as worthy experts and theorists of their own lives. And we have lots of examples of that. I would just argue that we don't always have as many as I would like. Studies might be enriched if an emphasis were placed on interviewing or conversing with young people in a planned and systematic fashion with a commitment to explicitly employing student understandings or youth understandings as central to the study, not as a complement to the opinions of adults. Even with the slippery sense-makings that we all have and construct, and I'm not romanticizing those of youth as not being complicated, what might it mean to speak and listen to students and youth in such a manner that representations which are created complicate and disrupt our very perceptions of what an adolescent is? This is one way that we as researchers can guard against presenting youth as a salient and universal category. I caution, however, that there's a difference between using the words of youth as a type of, quote, evidence, unquote, for a conclusion, rather than a piece of student and researcher sense-making. That is, having trouble listening to my own voice. That is, the utilization of snippets of non-contextualized data are employed in ways that draw one-dimensional views of a group of young people, rather than complicating and deepening views of queer youth. Employing fragments of students' words, their appearance, or the manner in which they speak to build our studies offers researchers a kind of authenticity and increases the validity or believability of what we offer. Yet what does it mean when we attribute such excerpts to a nameless student who is only identified through constructions such as black, queer, female, or 16? What is learned about this particular student or her life? In failing to give her or allow her to select a name or context for her life, are researchers and our readers more likely to make that youth, including queer youth, into shapeless, unmarked, at-risk, and undifferentiated bodies, lacking in complicated categorizations? With conclusions wrought from such renderings, are educational institutions then more likely to hone in on those categorizations and look for homogeneous solutions for very heterogeneous groupings? I want to argue that listening to students and then representing at least a number of the students' words and understandings in the context of their lives means that we as researchers combat stereotypical portrayals and normativity, thereby moving towards open-ended dynamic images of complex human beings who function in less abstracted material world. This, however, is not a call to voice. This is not a call to argue that we need to give students voice or give youth voice. In the larger piece, I talked quite a bit about how, drawing upon people like Liz Ellsworth and Mimi Orner, talking about how voice is problematic, that this isn't a call to empowerment, it's a call to polyvocality. So, and I'm really sorry if this gets to be too much, let me know.
Do you want water?
No, I keep trying.
Okay.
If it was a clean paper, I'd give it to somebody to read. It's not, though. Is advocating the use of students' words and sense-makings one more call to replace one authenticity for another, and perhaps more dangerously to give license to some researchers to expose youth words to greater appropriation? I'm not arguing that representing students' words or even acknowledging the theory-building aspects of such uses makes these voices essentially authentic. The representations are still partial, still contested, and still contestable. They do, perhaps, make youth more visible, but always through the filter of the researcher. Using students' words or youth words does not absolve the researcher from understanding the role of power and power relations in research, nor does it abdicate an analytical responsibility. I'm advocating a position that explicitly states that these are one voice in many, and that the meanings assigned by researcher and youth can be in tension and conflict. And I actually argue that that's where some of the most important analysis comes from. Well, I would argue that the researcher is always other. The kind of other we are with youth is complicated because my voice is just about gone. Because we as researchers often other those who are our subjects. Also to the youth, we are other, whether we seem to adopt the same constructions of identity or not. Perhaps in researching youth is more complicated because we have occupied that space of youth and retain assumptions, biases, and our own childlike unconscious lurking as we conduct research. As noted previously, there's always an imbalance of power with adult researchers of youth, which is not to state that youth lack agency or are powerless. They choose the questions to which they respond and how they answer them. The process of telling the stories of queer students, of offering a reader a perspective on what it's like to be a queer youth is flawed. It's flawed because the researcher can never get it right or tell the stories of the students' fully. Davies reminds us that data do not stand as transparent evidence of that which is real. Statements or descriptions reveal the ways in which sense is being made rather than the object of the sense-making. She says any tale told is merely one of many possible depictions. And we've heard a lot of this before, but what I'm arguing is that we often don't hear it played out in the research as we write our representations. That we may employ notions of polyvocality, but we rarely talk about how we do that in the data analysis and the data generation that we do. So a goal A goal is to invite the reader to see, in this case, queer youth as more than just nameless, faceless, white, at-risk youth who have the experiences, problems, joys, and passions, both particular to them and in common with others. Again, it's necessary to be cognizant of the pull of a romanticized view. While many queer youth are resilient, they are not wholly innocent either. There is no binary of bad youth, saved youth, or rescued youth. Many have and will continue to make less positive choices, act angry, impulsive, racist, homophobic, etc. So, as a researcher, what do we do when we're collecting difficult stories? When working with marginalized youth, and queer youth in particular, there's the possibility of uncovering stories and situations that, if they come to light and were attributed to the youth, could place the youth in jeopardy. This means that exposing illegal activities, drug use, unsafe sexual practices. To merely repeat these stories is, as Fine says, to risk their likely misuse. Similarly, Fine also asks, how do we handle the hot information? These concerns need to be addressed on multiple levels. First, is simply the level of how to protect the youth in order that the words she or he shared do not cause him or her harm. This is vital with any research subject, but particularly when the research is with those marginalized. How does one begin to resolve the struggle of how best, according to Fine, to represent the stories that may do more damage than good depending upon who consumes and exploits them? There is more than a hint of paternalism in the notion that the researcher knows better than the youth, I argue. However, as Lather argues, misrepresentation may be part of telling stories of people's lives. Ultimately, the researcher decides. Perhaps the ability and responsibility within this is the twin to acknowledging the impossibility of ethical research. This in turn calls for a contextualized, rigorous interrogation of what is best for the youth first and the study second. Therefore, there are times when a researcher will, quote, consciously and deliberately leave out some of the great stories that have the potential to become bad data. Again, quoting Fine. Secondly, there's a concern of playing off of good youth versus bad youth, within the bad stories only confirming the stereotypes of queer youth. For example, when researching gay
Just do your best.
Gay youth and educational achievement, one could focus only on those students who fail or who fit the oft-repeated statistics of those more likely to drop out, use drugs, attempt suicide, etc. In fact, these students' stories offer compelling reasons for educational institutions to combat heterosexism and homophobia. The narratives of overcoming trauma or chaos offer gripping reading, but also present a touch of the voyeuristic and the confessional. They prefer a feel-good account or a confirmation of what is wrong with the individual in the bad story, both of which, according to Fine, quote, feed our collective misunderstandings. Narratives such as these, I argue, leave difference unmarked. What does it mean if researcher always already leads to unforeseeable ramifications and confirmations of normativity? And I'm going to skip a section, forgive me, but I won't, my voice won't last. So I'm often left when talking about research with queer youth, about queer youth, is to talk about who's researching whom. And what I'm going to talk about now is contested work from me, and I would argue is a bit provocative. The issues embedded in conversations about who ought to conduct research with which groups or communities is not without controversy. I have to confess that I am not without my own conflict when discussing this issue. In the section below, I'm going to briefly outline the different points of view about researcher positionality with marginalized communities. Historically, we know there's been a dispute within social science affiliated qualitative researchers about the role of, and I'm using Narayan's term of native researcher. Similar to post-colonial ethnographers, North American researchers of color have faced an uphill battle in traditional anthropology when studying within their own communities. They face accusations of lacking objectivity. And we know so that within that, ethnographers of color were often told that they ought not research their own and that they could not research their own. There were, conversely, I'm trying to paraphrase so my voice holds up, there's a notion that insiders have a particular insightful view of their own community's roots, and this calls on standpoint theory and Du Bois's theory of double consciousness. I would argue that these are obviously competing notions. So you can't research your own group, or you have a special view of your own group. Michelle Foster speaks of researcher as insider, when researcher, she quotes, and researcher are members of the same cultural and speech community.
In the case of queer youth, insider status derived from queer youth's recognition of a researcher's membership in some facet of the community, and everybody has problematized the community today, may offer advantages during the fieldwork and greater access may be granted. Queer youth may be more likely to allow that researcher to ask difficult questions, including those of a personal nature. Hence, a queer researcher may receive answers to questions that those not identified as queer would not. Yet insider status is never complete. The term, quote, community, unquote, is in itself imaginary. Merely the differences with those who are incorporated under the rubric of LGBTQQTI, that is, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, queer, two-spirited, and intersex, demonstrates the fallacy of one community with a single identity politic. In the case of research with queer youth, at the most straightforward level, a researcher is not a youth. One's sensibilities and points of reference are different, and for example, a queer researcher does not belong to the youth and peer culture that's so vital to many queer youth. Depending upon the researcher, the types and frequencies of intersections amongst different axes of similarity across marginalizations, the fact that the researcher identifies as queer may be as complicating as it is advantageous. Narayan points out how absolutes and binaries embedded in insider-outsider status are less helpful when a positioning is partial, or is understood as partial. Whenever one seems to be located inside power dynamics, one will be simultaneously, I can't even read, render one outside. She suggests that rather than relying on an ideal that a, quote, native anthropologist will forward an authentic point of view, we might be more profitably viewing each researcher in terms of shifting identifications amid a field of interpenetrating communities and power relations, end quote. Therefore, viewing ourselves as being either inside or outside is a false dichotomy. We are never in or out, and neither is there an inherently best position from which to conduct research. Self-perceived membership in a particular community may alter the types of conversations and answers to which one is willing to listen to. In order to further trouble the notions of who an insider is, as we all know, Patricia Hill Collins spoke of the outsider within. The outsider within that she discusses is an African American researcher who is part of the Black community, but becomes an outsider to her own community as she receives training in the university. Collins was suggesting that one member of community is especially positioned to research in that community as long as the researcher remains self-conscious of how her education or other difference alters that positionality. However, if I have the option, I'm going to replace self-conscious, which relies on a possibility of knowledge, with critical understandings of non-dominant positions and previous questionings of normativity. That is, a queering of positionality that demands an interrogation of both the relation of the individual to the systemic and the functioning of the fluid body, queerly and non-queerly identified within particular research contexts. While I retain the knowledge of what it's like to be queer in relation to my life experiences and worldviews, this knowledge is specific to me. My positionality and subjectivity are not fixed along an axis. My relationship to dominant cultures is part of that culture, and as part of a person who is marginalized by it. Therefore, the insider status or multiple consciousness that I may carry is rooted in my own unique experiences and may bear some benefit in relation to research with queer youth. That is, that they are in some small way like me. But I can't rely on the idea that they are so much like me that our experiences and sense-making will be the same. In this case, standpoint theories and theories of multiple consciousness rely on a unified notion of where and how we, the researcher and the youth, meet each other in terms of gender or sexuality, but not in relation to other constructed identities. This means that the who of who that person is, the self with which one identifies, is not the same even though one might be hailed as gay, lesbian, queer, trans, etc. The who is always going to be different because the points of one's identity construction are different. Even within queer communities, there is much dissent of who is legitimately queer, who belongs, and who does not. For example, if I identify as queer and wish to research queer youth, do I have a standpoint with trans youth raised working class? Do I automatically have standpoint or multiple consciousness of those experiences in communities? We may share the identification of queer, but I certainly do not have intersecting lines across race or gender ambiguity, race, class, or gender ambiguity. So I'm going to tell a quick story and stop. So 2 years ago, at the Lavender Youth, at AERA, we brought in a youth group to talk to the Queer Studies SIG about research. And a lot of people assumed that the youth were going to come in and talk about how wonderful it is that there are queer researchers doing work with queer youth. And in point of fact, the youth came in and said, we don't really like what you do. And not only do we not like what we do, we think what you do is dangerous. A lot of the researchers in the room are really quite offended. That's fitting nicely. The youth laid out and some of the pressing research questions they hoped academics would address. And most of them were not issues that the academics in the room were addressing. The implicit understanding was that the youth were speaking to a predominantly queer audience, but any question of that they're having standing within that were quickly dispelled as the youth workers discussed issues of trust and power, and a few of the academics began their responses with great defensiveness. Among the issues that concerned the youth were trust and power imbalances between researcher youth and the community organizations. The program workers and youth also expressed an interest in researchers fostering accountability and sharing of monies with community-based organizations and the youth themselves. So this included the possibility of forming partnerships with CBOs and producing the findings in many forms, including those geared towards the practitioner, academic, and community members and youth. They also wanted to share institutional resources. And I point these out because I think that we assume that because we go into community organizations and we're offering something, that we're going to be accepted as those being something that we ought to be said thank you for. So, in the end, however, I'm still troubled about notions of multiple consciousness and standpoint theory, and the possibility of working queer methodologies as an avenue to challenge and confound alterity. But I'm also conflicted about the issue of who researches who. Even as I say what I say today, I'm still concerned about who goes into queer communities and does research with queer youth, based on the fact that there has been such appropriation over the years. So even as I question it, I'm still troubled by it. And this paper is not to assume that there are answers, because I'm still looking for ways to do methodology better, such that we're doing better work with, in my case, with queer youth.
Thank you.